Good afternoon, and we are here with this week's installment of 5 Minutes With. My name is Rich Nass. I am the Executive Vice President of Open Systems Media, and this week's guest is Tony King-Smith, who is also the Executive Vice President of the Technology Division of Imagination Technologies. Hello, Tony. How are you this morning?
I'm very well.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, it's actually afternoon your time, I guess, because you're in the UK.
Indeed. The sun's even trying to shine here in the UK.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay. So Imagination Technologies is, in my opinion at least, in an interesting position in that it has two processor architectures that could possibly be looked at as being competitive. Is that a fair assessment? And if it is, how do you deal with that?
Well, we don't have any competing architectures. We have complementary ones. If you're thinking of Meta and MIPS, then we used to have a processor architecture called Meta. The day we acquired MIPS, we announced the decision to shut down our Meta. And so the only CPU architecture we have is MIPS in everything that we do. However, we also have GPU, which we regard as a processor architecture as well. And indeed, we have a third, which is our RPU, which is our in-Sigma communications processors. So we think we know a fair amount about processor design. But in terms of CPUs, it's MIPS is our sole CPU architecture.
Very good. I was actually thinking of the GPU architecture because MIPS is
right.
Also in that same light, sort of.
Yeah. So and in that way, they don't compete at all. They very much complement one another. And indeed, at the front end of our GPUs, we actually have a small MIPS processor doing some of the scheduling. So, but the MIPS is a general-purpose CPU. The GPU is a much more tuned architecture for doing graphics processing, and it's fundamentally a parallel processor. I guess where you may see the overlap is that the GPU is seen increasingly as a parallel processor, so GPU compute and heterogeneous processing. But in heterogeneous processing, a GPU is still a very specialized compute element, whereas the MIPS processor is a much more general-purpose processor, which runs C and Linux and all the operating systems and languages you would expect of a mainstream processor. So the two actually complement each other, and that's one of the cornerstones of heterogeneous processing, which we think is very much front and center for a lot of what's happening next in processor designs in all sorts of markets.
Okay, very good. Okay, so now it may be unfair in the characterization, but I put the MIPS architecture in the same class with an ARM architecture, partly because it's a core that you're licensing and you guys aren't actually selling the silicon. The ARM architecture, for lots of reasons, has really gotten a big amount of the spotlight, and the MIPS architecture has not got the same amount of attention. Why do you think that is, or am I looking at it incorrectly?
Well, no, it's absolutely right to compare MIPS and ARM. They're both 32-bit and 64-bit RISC architectures, and so and they're both licensable to mainstream markets, and they both run every major operating system and language imaginable. What you've got to look at is the history, is that MIPS has been around for the best part of 25 years, 30 years, coming out of Stanford University. It was the original granddaddy of RISC processors. ARM came along after that, again, building on a RISC background. But for quite a few years, MIPS was significantly larger in footprint than ARM. And to this day, MIPS continues to enjoy a very substantial footprint in areas like networking and enterprise. The reason why you see this distortion, I mean, ARM has done a great job at developing their portfolio and marketing it, but the big area where they gained a lot of traction was in mobile. Now, mobile is a sector that has sort of come to dominate our industry in terms of units shipped. It's shipping in billions of units a year. There's not many market segments that will claim that. And ARM did a very good job at focusing on that at a time when the people running MIPS were focused in other areas like networking and enterprise and other embedded applications. And to be honest with you, the MIPS management took their eye off the ball and underestimating the rate of acceleration of mobile. And by the time they tried to respond to that, they were quite a few years late, and we see, as a result, ARM enjoys a commanding near monopoly of mobile today. We're obviously here to fix that, and one of the things is MIPS lost credibility in mobile, whereas Imagination's reputation has been built in mobile, so nobody doubts we know a lot about ultra-low power processing for mobile, and we're applying that to MIPS as we speak today. But it's important to remember that the world is more than just mobile app processors, and many other market segments where MIPS enjoys significant market share. Networking and enterprise are very commanding shares, and a variety of other embedded markets which are less visible but nonetheless still are very substantial businesses for us. So MIPS is very strong, and we're growing it. We just had a record year of shipments, and whilst it may not have the same volumes as ARM today, we have every intention of changing that ratio moving forward, but it has a very substantial and strong base today.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I should have thought of that myself, that it is a lot in the volumes, and while it does ship in billions, I assume the royalties are probably significantly less on something that ships in the billions than a lower volume. Okay, we are just about out of time, but since I have you and you have an experience that I'd like to share with the audience, you worked at some of the major Japanese vendors, and now you work for a British company.
Yep.
Really quickly, what's the biggest difference in culture between a Japanese company and a British company?
Almost everything. It's the simple answer. I worked for Hitachi and Panasonic for about 13 years. Before that, I worked for a Californian company, LSI Logic, and now with a British company. I think British and U.S. companies, certainly in the semiconductor space, have a fairly similar culture. There are obviously nuances in British culture versus the U.S. culture, but they're not dissimilar, whereas the Japanese culture is so much more structured, much more hierarchical, much more systematic in the way it deals with things. And I was privileged reporting into Japan to see the underbelly of how these Japanese companies operate, and when they do things well, they do them extremely well. I think, Japan Inc. is struggling to respond to the rate of change that's happening in the industry now, but I think we're seeing signs that they're finding their way, and because of our understanding, Imagination has worked with Japanese customers like Renesas for many years and built very successful businesses. So we're very confident Japan's coming back, but you do need to understand the way the Japanese think and behave and make sure your operations can respond that way. And that's very disciplined and very structured. And it would certainly be quite a change to come from them to Imagination.
Very good. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That was Tony King-Smith, the Executive Vice President of the Technology Division of Imagination Technologies. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.